So today we're on the Jeremy Vine Show with Anne Widdecombe. Always a pleasure, never a chore. And a new poll reveals just how catastrophically unpopular Liz Truss is, despite her frankly pathetic attempt at an apology. Is her badly delivered apology going to pay for people's increased mortgage bills? Is her badly delivered sorry going to pay people's increased rents? People forget about private renters because the mortgage hike will be passed on to them as well. Is it going to pay for their £5,000 a year energy bills? Now that's been scaled back as well. Is it going to pay for the shredded public services, which are now going to have Jeremy Hunt's scalpel applied to them after 12 years of slash and burn cuts? Look, there's a reason that according to YouGov's latest polling, Liz Truss's net approval rating is nearly the same in this country as Vladimir Putin. She's on minus 70, he's on minus 74.
Is it minus? It was minus 47 last time I looked.
She's now on minus 70. Vladimir Putin's on minus 74. But do you know what? I'm going to defend Liz Truss, and that might sound a bit odd, given what I just said. Because I know what the Tories are going to do. They're going to do what they did with Theresa May. They're going to keep her in place, let her take all of the political shrapnel thrown her way, absorb it, and then dispose of her as soon as they think there's an opportune moment, and then go, it was all her fault, hey presto. And do you know what? This is on all of them. Jeremy Hunt, now presented as some elder statesman, the grown-up in the room, who left the NHS underprepared for the pandemic with grotesque staff shortages, and who celebrated austerity as the genius of David Cameron Osborne. Of course he wants to cut more back.
And come in on this. And doesn't agree.
Again.
Go on, you've gone.
Rishi Sunak, who boasted in the leadership campaign of taking from poorer communities to give them to richer communities. Look, these people, to coin a phrase, are all in this together.
But you don't like Keir Starmer either. You don't like anybody.
Do you know what? I don't want to go on a camping trip with Keir Starmer. I don't want to move in with Keir Starmer.
You said he was just trying to attract Waitrose customers.
No, I shop in Waitrose myself sometimes. There's nothing wrong with having a little joke about Waitrose customers, Jeremy. But my objection to Keir Starmer, and I have many objections with Keir Starmer, are completely eclipsed by the catastrophe of this government. We've got to kick them all out.
Okay,
and an imperfect Labour government's better than this, for God's sake.
Anne Widdecombe, is he right?
What, Owen?
Yes.
No, of course he's not right. But he does make some perfectly valid points. And one point is that if we're simply going back to austerity, well, we've had years of that and it didn't work. And we actually, I think, need a completely new approach to the economy. And that was the approach that was on offer. Unfortunately, it was so badly bungled that it's now all been destroyed. And I actually agree with Owen's comments about Jeremy Hunt. This is the man who came very, very low in the leadership stakes, is now the de facto Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, he is. Well, that's the measure they care.
I get angry hearing that from... I mean, Anne, you're right, austerity was a failure. But the reason I get so angry hearing that is for years we were told there was no alternative to these slash and burn cuts, which have produced the longest squeeze in wages in this country since records began, shredded public services.
The reason given for it was that we didn't have the money to spend on the public services because of what Labour had done, just to be clear, and therefore they cut spending, but also they raised taxes. So the simultaneous thing of the two meant the country was rather an unhappy place for a while.
The reason that they said that, the Labour government had got them into that position was very straightforward. There was an actual note from a Labour Treasury Minister, the famous note saying there's nothing left. There wasn't. But there is a difference between having a policy to address an immediate problem and then just keeping it and
Let's get a call.
So the point about collective guilt, collective responsibility is really, really important, because we saw with Theresa May, didn't we? We saw what happened. Boris Johnson came along and pretended he was some brand new shiny government. Now, it looks pretty far-fetched for them to try again, but that is the trick that they're going to try and pull off. And this rehabilitation of villains and monsters is one of the reasons that this country's in such a mess. You can see it across the Atlantic with George W. Bush. He's a war criminal. He should be in jail, languishing for the crimes he committed against the Iraqi people, amongst others. But because of the vulgarity of Donald Trump, he was portrayed since as some sort of statesman, where liberals cooed over him as he handed a piece of candy to Michelle Obama during the funeral of John McCain. And they do this for Tories here. George Osborne, no politician is more responsible for the disaster inflicted on this country than him. His ideologically charged austerity, which led to the longest squeeze in living standards for workers for generations. Without that, Brexit would have happened, and all the political turmoil that this country's had, the decimation of our public services, the obviously terrible human consequences. And yet you have him on television, interviewed not as the accused in the dock, but as some sort of impartial witness, shown again as a grown-up in the room in comparison to this current clusterfuck. And you can see it as well, as I said, with Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak, by the way, who during the pandemic brought in lockdown skeptics into number 10 to delay restrictions back in the autumn of 2020 successfully, which just meant that infection spiraled out of control. And then we had a longer lockdown as a consequence, and the variant, which you may remember, which was called the Kent variant at the time. These politicians cause disaster after disaster. There is no accountability, and that's why we end up with an ever worsening disaster. And, this is a death cult. The Tories are a political death cult. We've had now, when Liz Truss is removed from office, I mean, she's already out of power, but when she's actually out of office, that will mean we will have had, in the last 6 years, nearly 30% of all our post-war prime ministers. David Cameron chewed up, Theresa May chewed up, Boris Johnson chewed up, Liz Truss chewed up by this death cult. And unfortunately, the hunger for toppling their own leaders is only eclipsed by their hunger for devastating cuts to public services and the welfare state, which have caused so much misery. And Jeremy Hunt is an ideologically driven pro-austerity ideologue. Kind of said ideological twice there, but you get the point. And the idea now that the scalpel is going to be taken to public services and the welfare state, when we've already had, we're talking about cuts to education, cuts to a national health service, which he was in charge of as health secretary and left us woefully unprepared for the pandemic because of the squeeze in its funding and the lack of staff. Like, at some point, there has to be accountability. And the only way we can finally have some form of hope for this country is for this death cult to be removed from office. It doesn't matter whether they're Cameroons or they're, the ultra-Brexiteers, they're so-called moderates or right-wingers. From David Cameron to Boris Johnson to Liz Truss, all of them have plunged this country into its worst crisis since the war. And they said they blamed Labour for the financial crisis of 2008, a global financial crisis. But you can literally pin this on what the Tories have done. Yeah, there are global crises going on, but they've managed to accelerate the impact on ordinary people. That's why it's so important to make this clear that this isn't on Liz Truss. Don't let her be the fall guy. The fact now she's less popular, she's nearly as unpopular as Vladimir Putin, I think speaks volumes in terms of the catastrophe she's unleashed. But this is on all of them. To coin a phrase, they're all in this together. And unless, we stop pretending there are decent Tories, like Jeremy Hunt, who's been portrayed as this steady hand on the till, even though he's responsible for so much of the disasters that this country's currently in, unless they are all held to account, this country is F-U-C-K-E-D, and for a long time to come.